The man in the gray felt hat was laughing. He stood at the center of Millhaven's main square with one boot propped on the edge of the dry stone fountain, surrounded by men who laughed because he laughed, the way smaller fires catch from a bigger one. And Walter Garrett stood 12 feet away, holding a coffee cup Beverly had just handed him through the diner's side window. Watching, Walter's hands didn't shake. That was the part nobody would remember later, but it was the part that mattered most. His hands, cracked along every fold, dark-lined at the knuckles, wide as a fence post, held that cup perfectly still, while Clifford Whitaker told the assembled crowd that the land deal was as good as done, that some things in Millhaven had always been exactly what they looked like, and that certain people were just built for certain things in this world. And that was simply the truth of it. And nobody ought to feel bad about a truth. Walter took one slow sip of coffee. The cup was white ceramic with a chip on the rim that Beverly had patched with clear nail polish. And the coffee was black, the way he'd taken it for 50 years. And in the inside left pocket of his worn canvas vest, folded in 3, with edges just barely golden from age, was a document that was about to make every single person in that square go very, very quiet. But before he tells you what was in that pocket, before any of that, you need to understand what kind of man Walter Garrett was. Because the document was only part of the story. The bigger part was the 30 years he spent waiting to use it. Before we go back to where this all began, I want to ask you something quick. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or state in the comments. We love knowing where our listeners are finding us from. Now, back to Walter. Walter Dale Garrett was born in 1957 in a farmhouse 6 miles east of what would later become the town limits of Millhaven, Texas. The farmhouse no longer stands. It was taken down in 1981 when the county widened the road. But the land it stood on is still there, red and flat and stubborn, the way Texas land tends to be. His father, Clarence Elton Garrett, was a man who believed in 2 things without question: the worth of a day's honest labor and the permanence of a written record. Clarence had a 4th-grade education and hands that looked like leather work gloves even when they were bare. He could not write in cursive, but he could read print well enough, and he read every document he ever signed 3 times before he touched a pen. In the spring of 1959, when Walter was 2 years old and had no memory of it yet, Clarence Garrett purchased 17 acres of land in what would become Millhaven's western edge. He paid $420 for it, every cent saved over 11 years of field work, in a transaction witnessed by the county clerk and recorded at the Millhaven courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon in April. The deed was filed under the name Clarence Elton Garrett. The land was given a parcel number. A copy was handed to Clarence in a manila envelope, which he brought home, showed to his wife Edna, and placed inside a metal biscuit tin in the kitchen cabinet above the stove. Walter grew up on that land. He learned to walk on it. He learned to drive a tractor on it at 11. He buried a dog named Harpo at the eastern corner of it when he was 14. The land was his, in the way that a child understands a thing is his, not by document, but by the weight of memory pressed into the soil. Clarence died in 1974 from a heart attack at 59. Walter was 17. He inherited the metal tin and everything inside it. He was old enough to understand what the deed meant, young enough to believe it would never need to be defended. He was wrong about that. The Whitaker family arrived in Millhaven in 1976. Not one at a time, not quietly. They arrived the way money tends to arrive in small towns, which is to say, all at once, and with the expectation that people would notice. Eugene Whitaker Sr., Clifford's father, had made a considerable sum in commercial real estate in Amarillo and decided in his mid-50s that he wanted land. Real land. The kind that didn't have a concrete parking lot on top of it. He bought 600 acres on Millhaven's north and west edges over the course of 3 years. He bought parcels from farmers who were struggling, from estates whose heirs had moved to cities and didn't want the maintenance, and from the county itself, which had 2 parcels of unclaimed land it was happy to offload. He also, in 1982, purchased what the courthouse records listed as Parcel 14B, Western Quadrant, Millhaven, status, unregistered. 17 acres. The Garrett land. The how of it was never made perfectly clear to Walter, even later. What he knew, what he pieced together slowly over years, was that at some point in 1987, the original filing under Clarence Garrett's name had been pulled from the county ledger. Not destroyed. Pulled. The page was simply gone, and in its place, a notation that read, Registration error, Parcel 14B, transferred to county surplus. Acquired Whitaker Holdings, 1982. Earl Coleman, then 45 and 3 years into his job as county clerk, had signed the notation. Walter found out in 1988 when he went to the courthouse to register a home improvement permit, and a different clerk, looking at his address, said with some confusion, "This property is listed under Whitaker Holdings. Is there an arrangement in place?" He was 31 years old. He drove home. He sat on the porch for 3 hours without going inside. Then he opened the cabinet above the stove, took the metal biscuit tin down, and checked the deed his father had kept. It was still there. Original ink. Original witness signatures. County seal, stamped and clear. He put it back. He kept working the land. He kept working the land for 30 more years. People in Millhaven had different theories about Walter Garrett. Most of them were wrong in the same direction. They thought he was simple. Not slow, exactly, but uncomplicated in the way of a man who had never wanted more than what he had, and so had never developed the interior friction that ambition creates. He was good people in the way that Millhaven used that phrase, meaning he worked hard, caused no trouble, never asked for anything, and could be trusted to show up when he said he would. Beverly Lane knew better, but Beverly had known Walter for 40 years, which gave her a different angle. Beverly was 63 and had run Lane's Diner on Garrison Road since she was 28, when her mother's knees gave out and the question of who would take over had a simple answer. The diner had 8 tables, a counter with 6 stools, a pie case that Beverly restocked every Tuesday and Thursday, and a coffee maker that she replaced every 4 years on schedule, the way some people replace tires. Walter's table was the corner booth, second from the back, left side, the one with the window that looked out on the alley rather than the street, which suited him fine. Beverly had stopped asking him what he wanted to drink when he was in his late 40s. She just brought coffee. Black. And if it was a Thursday, a slice of the buttermilk pie without being asked, because she had noticed years ago that he only ordered pie when he was working something out in his head. And by the time he got around to ordering it, she'd already given him the thinking time the pie was meant to accompany. "He's got more patience with paper than any man I ever knew," Beverly told her niece once, watching Walter through the kitchen window as he sat in his booth with a folded document he'd been reading for 20 minutes. And that's saying something, because paper is mostly just waiting in a different form. Her niece nodded and went back to the dishes. That was a Tuesday morning in October, 7 months before everything changed. The announcement came on a Wednesday in March, posted at the Millhaven Cooperative Board on a laminated sheet and covered in the County Weekly the following Friday. Walter read the notice on Thursday. He'd gone to the cooperative for a bag of fertilizer and seen it on the board. He read it twice, standing in the hardware aisle with the fertilizer bag hanging from his left hand. And then he went home. He sat on the porch. The Catavento, the old windmill at the back of the property, rang its rusty note in the dry wind. Walter had listened to that sound for 5 decades. He'd told Beverly once that when it finally stopped, he'd probably hear the silence before he heard the absence of the sound, if that made any sense. And Beverly had said it made perfect sense. He went inside. He took the metal biscuit tin from the cabinet above the stove. The same cabinet, the same tin, 40 years later. And he sat at the kitchen table with the deed and a notepad and worked through what he knew. The land was worth 3 times what it had been worth 2 years ago because of the distribution hub. Agripath, coming in from outside the county, would be represented by lawyers who didn't know anyone in Millhaven, which meant they didn't owe anything to anyone in Millhaven, which meant that a valid competing claim on the title would not be politely ignored the way it might be locally. He had the original deed. He had been keeping it for 30 years. He called a law office in Lubbock on Friday morning. He asked, carefully and without explanation, whether a land deed from 1959 that had been improperly removed from county records could be used to challenge a current ownership claim. The woman who answered said she'd have the attorney call him back. The attorney called him back in 45 minutes. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 38, originally from El Paso, and he asked Walter 3 questions before he said anything else. Is the deed original? Is the county seal present? And do you have any witnesses or secondary documentation to support the original filing? Walter answered yes to the first 2. He said he didn't know about the third. Bring me what you have, Marcus Webb said. Let me see what we're working with. It was the following Tuesday that Clifford Whitaker made his remarks in the square. The occasion was nothing formal, just a small gathering that had formed organically after a county commissioners' meeting, the way gatherings tend to in small towns, when something has been on everyone's mind, and someone with a loud voice decides to speak it. Clifford had a loud voice. He'd been born with it, and had spent 58 years making sure everyone knew it. He was standing at the center of the square with his gray felt cowboy hat, the one with the jacaranda leather band he mentioned whenever someone looked at it too long. And he had the posture of a man who considered every inch of Millhaven visible from where he stood to be, in some fundamental way, his. Not because he'd earned it exactly, because it had always been his, which, in his experience, was the same thing. The deal's good for everybody, he was saying when Walter came around the corner with his coffee. This town needs the revenue. The land's been sitting underperforming for years. Agripath comes in, brings jobs, everybody wins. One of the men near him, Donnie Marsh, who ran the feed store, said something Walter didn't catch about zoning, and then someone else mentioned the question of the Western Parcel Access Road. And Donnie said, maybe just to keep the conversation moving, that it seemed like Walter ought to have some say, since he'd worked that land longer than most people had been in Millhaven. Clifford didn't even fully turn his head. He adjusted the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, looked out at something above and beyond the assembled faces, and said, Walter works the land. He doesn't own anything. Never has. Never will. Some men are built to follow a plow, and that's just the truth of it. He said it the way a man states a fact about weather. No malice in the voice. Something worse than malice. Complete indifference. Walter held his coffee cup with both hands, the chip on the rim pressed against his left thumb. Beverly, watching from the diner window, later said that she had never, in 40 years, seen Walter's face do what it did in that moment. Not angry, not sad, not even particularly affected. Just settled, like a man who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and has just watched it happen exactly as he expected. He took one slow sip of coffee. He turned around and walked back to his truck. And that evening, he called Raymond. Raymond Garrett had not been back to Millhaven in 14 months. He knew this because his wife had mentioned it twice, once in passing, and once with the particular gentleness that means she had thought about it more than she was letting on. He was sitting at his kitchen table in Dallas when his phone rang, and when he saw the area code, his stomach did the small, specific clench it always did when Millhaven called. Not because he didn't love his father. He did, in the complicated way of a son who had never quite figured out how to be in the same room as the man he came from. He loved his father the way you love a place you left, with warmth and guilt in equal measure. Dad, Ray. Walter's voice on the phone was what it always was. Level. No variation of urgency. Everything okay? Things are in motion, Walter said. I need you to do something for me. Raymond waited. I need you to come home for a few days. There was a silence on Raymond's end that Walter understood. It had the particular quality of a man calculating something. Time, cost, the machinery of excuses. Is it health? Raymond asked. No. Then can it wait until... It's waited 30 years, Walter said. I'd rather it not wait longer. Raymond didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I'll check flights. Walter said, there's something I should have shown you a long time ago. And then he hung up, the way he always hung up, without goodbye, but not unkindly. Just done. Raymond arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a silver rental car that he parked on the county road rather than pulling into the property, and he sat in the driver's seat for 1 minute and 40 seconds. Beverly's niece counted from the window of the diner across the road, looking at the house his father had lived in for 60 years. It was a modest house, white paint, mostly, or what had been white, now the particular gray of old latex that's been through too many Texas summers. The porch ran the length of the front and had 2 chairs on it, a wooden rocker with a crocheted cushion that had been Dorothy's, and a straight-back chair with no cushion that had always been Walter's. There were flower boxes under the 2 front windows that still had Dorothy's plants in them, now just the dried stalks of things that hadn't been tended in 11 years. And Raymond felt the absence of that. The stalks, the untended, more than he had expected to. He got out of the car. Walter was on the porch. He had a cup of coffee and the canivete, the small Swiss Army knife that he'd carried for 30 years, the one he cleaned his nails with when he was thinking. And he was doing exactly that when Raymond came up the gravel path. Raymond sat in his mother's chair. They did not embrace. They never had been an embracing family. Raymond said, "It's hot," and Walter said, "Always is." And then they were quiet for a while, which was how the two of them always began, as if they needed to relearn the temperature of each other before any real conversation could happen. After a while, Walter said, "You see the announcement about the land?" Raymond had. He'd read it online, in a Millhaven County news aggregator he'd never unsubscribed from, for reasons he'd never examined. "I saw it. You come to try to talk me into taking a settlement," Walter said. It wasn't a question. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then honestly, "Something like that." Walter nodded, slowly, as if Raymond had confirmed something. "Dad," Raymond said, "I know this place means a lot to you, but you don't." He stopped. "Say it." "You don't have any legal standing here. The Whitakers own the property. You've been renting." "I've never paid rent to the Whitakers," Walter said. "Not $1. Not in 30 years. Raymond blinked. "Then what?" "The arrangement," Walter said carefully, "was that I worked the land in exchange for use of the house. That was the arrangement that Clifford's father proposed in 1988. I accepted it. Not because it was right, because it gave me time." Raymond looked at his father. "Time for what?" Walter looked out at the property, the red earth, the mesquite line along the western fence, the rusted catavento turning in the late afternoon heat. "Go inside," he said. "Top cabinet, biscuit tin." Raymond came back out with the tin and held it like he wasn't sure what it contained. Walter said, "Your grandfather bought this land in 1959, paid $420. I've got the original deed. The filing was pulled from county records in 1987. I know who pulled it, and I know why." I've had a lawyer in Lubbock working on the authentication for 3 weeks. Raymond looked at the tin, then at his father. You've known this whole time. Walter didn't answer. You worked their land for 30 years knowing it was yours. I worked my land, Walter said quietly, and waited. Raymond set the tin on the porch railing. He looked out at the same view his father had been looking at. The flat red land, the mesquite, the fence line running to the horizon. He tried to understand the shape of it. 30 years of knowing, 30 years of silence, 30 years of being called a ranch hand by a man who was standing on ground that wasn't his. Why didn't you just show people? Raymond asked. Why wait? Walter looked at his son for a long moment. Your grandfather always said, don't show your hand before you know the table. He paused. I wasn't sure the table was ready until now, until there was someone coming from outside who didn't owe Clifford Whitaker anything. Raymond said nothing. The man from Agripath, Walter said. He's from Lubbock. His lawyers are from Lubbock. They don't know anyone here, which means they'll look at the paperwork and see what the paperwork says, not what Clifford wants them to see. Raymond sat back in his mother's chair. He ran a hand over his face. How long have you been planning this? Walter picked up the canivete and cleaned his thumbnail with the small blade. Slowly, methodically. Since 1988, he said. I just needed the right room. Raymond stared at his father. And then, slowly, as the meaning of it settled, not just the legal strategy, but the 30 years of it, the daily weight of knowing and staying quiet, of being called nothing by a man who had built his certainty on stolen ground, Raymond felt something shift in his chest, something that had been sitting in one position for a very long time. He didn't say anything yet, but he stopped looking at his father the way he had for the last 20 years, like a man he could not quite understand. He started looking at him like a man he was only now beginning to. 2 days before the cooperative meeting, 2 days before Clifford Whitaker planned to stand in front of the town and accept applause for selling something he did not own, there was a knock at Walter's door at 7 in the morning. He opened it to find Earl Coleman on the porch. Earl was 71 years old and had the look of a man who hadn't slept well in several decades. He wore a green and brown flannel shirt despite the Texas heat. He always wore it, Beverly had once told Raymond, as if he needed the layers. And his hands, which had once been steady enough to stamp 100 county documents a day without error, were now slightly tremulous when he held them at his sides. He didn't say hello. He said, I think you know why I'm here. Walter stepped back and held the door open. Earl came in and sat at the kitchen table without being invited, the way a man sits when he's been carrying something heavy for so long that the first available surface becomes a necessity. He set a manila envelope on the table. It was old, water-stained at one corner, the clasp brass green with age. He said, I kept this because throwing it away would have made me the kind of man I didn't want to be. I told myself for 37 years that the right time would come. I'm not going to lie to you, Walter. I don't know if this is the right time, but it might be the last one. Walter sat across from him and did not open the envelope yet. He looked at Earl, the flannel shirt, the unsteady hands, the eyes that had been avoiding his for 3 decades. He said, I know you were told to do it. I'm not here to make you feel worse than you already do. Earl looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, the way you look at a person when you haven't allowed yourself to before. Then he nodded, once, very slowly, and pushed the envelope across the table. Walter opened it. Inside was a photocopy of a memorandum, typed on official county stationery, dated October 14th, 1987. It read, below it, in different handwriting, Earl's, clearly older, in slightly shaky ballpoint, was a single additional line, written and dated 37 years after the original. Walter read it twice. He folded it back into the envelope. He said, "I'll need you to say that to an attorney." Earl said, "I'll say it to whoever needs to hear it." They sat for a moment without speaking. The Catavento turned in the morning wind outside, its metal ring the only sound. Walter said, "You want coffee?" Earl said, "Please." And that was the entirety of 37 years being put down. Raymond came into the kitchen while Earl was on his second cup. He stopped when he saw the old man at the table, and his eyes went to the envelope and then to his father. And Walter said simply, "Raymond, this is Earl Coleman. He was county clerk here for 22 years. Raymond shook Earl's hand. Earl looked at Raymond the way people sometimes look at the children of people they've wronged, with an effort at steadiness that doesn't quite arrive. "I knew your grandfather," Earl said. "Clarence was a good man, the kind of man who paid what he owed and expected the same in return." He paused. "I'm sorry, I wasn't that kind of man when it mattered." Raymond didn't say anything. He looked at his father, who was refilling his own coffee, and then he sat down at the table between the two old men. And for the rest of that morning, the three of them went through everything. The original deed, the authentication letters from Marcus Webb's office in Lubbock, the memorandum, and Marcus's outline of the legal strategy, piece by piece, in the particular quiet of men doing careful work. At one point, Raymond looked up from a document and said, to no one in particular, "This is real." Walter said, "Always was." The meeting at the Millhaven Cooperative was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Friday. Clifford Whittaker had been preparing for it the way he prepared for anything he considered a formality, which was to say, with the confidence of a man who has never once had a plan fail in a way he didn't see coming. He'd had a suit pressed, which he rarely did. He'd called the county newspaper to make sure someone would be there. He'd told his wife Marlene that this was the kind of moment a family should remember. The cooperative's meeting room held about 60 people, if some of them stood, and by 1:45 it was close to full. Millhaven didn't have many events that brought people out on a Friday afternoon. This qualified. Clifford was at the front of the room, beside a table where he'd placed the sale agreement for the Agripath transaction. 2 copies in a manila folder, weighted at the corner with a coffee mug that had the Whittaker Holdings name on it, which Beverly, watching from near the back, found almost admirably shameless. The Agripath representative was there too. His name was Tom Greaves, and he was a compact man in a navy blue suit who had flown in from Lubbock that morning and was taking notes on a yellow legal pad, because that was what Tom Greaves did at every meeting. He took notes because notes were a record, and a record was the only thing that mattered when everyone's memory later became selective. Clifford began speaking at 2 o'clock exactly. He spoke well, in the practiced cadence of a man who had been the loudest voice in whatever room he entered for the past 40 years. He talked about the history of the Whittaker family in Millhaven, about his father's vision, about the land that had been cultivated and cared for and brought to its current value through 3 generations of stewardship. He talked about Agripath and the 40 jobs and the county tax base. He said the words community and legacy 3 times each, with increasing gravity. He was winding toward the signature moment, the part where he would sign the first copy of the agreement, while Tom Greaves signed the second, and the photographer from the county paper would capture it. When the door at the back of the cooperative opened, Walter Garrett came in. He was wearing the same canvas vest he always wore, the sandy beige one with 4 front pockets and the worn edges and the inside left pocket that bulged slightly. He had his hat in his hand, not on his head, which was unusual. And he was not alone. Raymond was behind him, and behind Raymond was Marcus Webb, the attorney from Lubbock, the compact 38-year-old in a charcoal jacket who was carrying a leather document folder that he held the way professionals hold things they're about to use. The room shifted slightly in the way rooms do when something unexpected enters them. Clifford saw Walter and did not change his expression, because changing his expression would have meant acknowledging that Walter's presence meant something, and Clifford had spent 30 years not acknowledging that. He said, smoothly, without breaking cadence, "Walter, good to see you. We're just about to wrap up here. If you want to stay for the—" Marcus Webb moved past Raymond and Walter and walked directly to the table where Tom Greaves was sitting. He said, "Mr. Greaves, I represent Walter Dale Garrett in a matter pertaining to the title of Parcel 14B, Western Quadrant, Millhaven County. I need to present documentation before any transaction proceeds. I believe you'll want to see this before you sign anything." Tom Greaves looked up from his yellow legal pad. He looked at Marcus, then at the leather folder. He said, "I'm listening." The room went very quiet. Marcus Webb opened the folder. He laid 3 documents on the table in front of Tom Greaves. The first was the original deed, the one Clarence Garrett had filed in April 1959, now authenticated by the Lubbock County Records Office and a forensic document specialist, with an accompanying letter confirming that the ink, paper, and seal were consistent with county records from that period. The second was the memorandum from Earl Coleman's envelope, the one ordering the removal of the Garrett filing from county records in 1987, signed by Earl and citing instruction from Eugene Whitaker Sr. The third was a sworn statement from Earl Coleman himself, notarized 2 days earlier, affirming that he had removed the Garrett filing under direct instruction from Eugene Whitaker Sr. and had retained a personal copy of the order. Tom Greaves read all 3. He read them the way he read everything, carefully, completely, without speaking. No one in the room spoke either. The reading took 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, Walter stood near the back of the room with his hat in his hands and waited, as he had waited for 30 years, with the same particular stillness that Beverly had noticed across a counter for 4 decades. The kind that was not resignation, but something closer to its opposite. Absolute certainty that the moment has been prepared for. Tom Greaves finished reading. He set the documents down. He looked up at Clifford Whitaker. He said, quietly, not loudly, not for the room, but the room heard it. "Mr. Whitaker, this property may not be yours to sell." And in the silence that followed, the only sound in the Millhaven Cooperative meeting room was the dry creak of someone shifting in a folding chair near the window. Clifford's hat slid forward on his head. He caught it with one hand. He held it. For the first time that Walter could remember, Clifford Whitaker did not look out above the heads of the people around him. He looked directly at Walter, and for just one moment, without the posture, without the hat on properly, without the certainty that had always held his face together, he looked like something very different from what he had always appeared to be. He looked like a man who had known, somewhere underneath everything, for a very long time. Tom Greaves addressed the room. "I need to suspend this meeting pending title review. Agripath cannot proceed with any transaction on property under active ownership dispute. We'll be in touch with all parties when we have clarity on the legal record." He gathered his yellow legal pad. He shook Marcus Webb's hand. He did not shake Clifford's. Clifford left the cooperative through the side door, not dramatically, without drama, which was somehow worse. He walked out to the way you leave a room when you understand that staying would require you to be a kind of person you don't know how to be yet. Beverly watched him go from near the back. She said later to her niece that the most striking thing was that when he passed through the door into the afternoon sun, a gust of wind came from the east, the dry, flat, constant Texas wind that Millhaven always had, and it caught his gray felt hat and lifted it cleanly off his head and sent it skipping across the gravel toward the road. Clifford watched it go. He did not chase it. The legal process took 93 days. Marcus Webb filed the competing title claim in Millhaven County Court on a Monday. The county records office presented with Earl's sworn statement and the authenticated original deed, launched its own internal review. A state-level land records examiner came down from Lubbock the following week and spent 2 days in the courthouse basement with the ledgers from 1959 to 1990. His report, filed at the end of the third week, was 11 pages long, and its conclusion was contained in a single sentence. The 1987 removal of the Garrett filing was improper, lacks supporting documentation for administrative cause, and does not meet the standard required for a valid title transfer under Texas property law. The Whitaker family's attorneys contested it. They argued procedural grounds, they argued statute of limitations, they argued continuity of use, and each argument was answered methodically by Marcus Webb's documentation. The original deed had not been destroyed. A sworn witness account of the improper removal existed, and crucially, Walter had never stopped using and maintaining the land as its owner, with no payment of rent to Whitaker Holdings, a fact that, in Texas property law, carried significant weight. 93 days after the cooperative meeting, the county recorder's office issued a certificate of title correction. Parcel 14B, Western Quadrant, Millhaven County, 17 acres of red, flat, stubborn Texas land, was officially re-registered under the name Walter Dale Garrett. Walter received the paperwork by certified mail on a Wednesday morning. He took it to the kitchen table. He read it once. He folded it and put it in the metal biscuit tin, next to the original deed. Then he sat for a while in the quiet of the kitchen, with the sound of the catavento coming through the window, and he said, out loud, to no one who was there, or perhaps to someone, "I told you I'd take care of it." Raymond had gone back to Dallas after the cooperative meeting, but he came back 3 weeks later and stayed longer than planned. He brought his wife, Carol, and his 2 daughters, Emma, 13, and Lily, 10, who had never properly been to Millhaven and who greeted the Texas heat with the focused objection of people accustomed to air conditioning. Walter showed them the property with the Canavetti in his vest pocket, walking the fence line in the morning when it was still cool enough, explaining things in the unhurried way he explained everything, which Emma found strange, and Lily found interesting, and Carol found quietly affecting in a way she mentioned to Raymond that night. Raymond and Walter talked more in those 3 weeks than they had in the previous 20 years. Not because they had suddenly become different people, but because the context had changed. And context, it turns out, is most of what makes a conversation possible. One evening near the end of Raymond's stay, they were on the porch after dinner. Beverly's buttermilk pie between them on the railing, the last light going pink across the flat land. And Raymond said, "Why didn't you just show people sooner, Dad? All those years." Walter was quiet for a moment. The catavento turned once, then twice, in the evening wind. "Your grandfather always said," he replied, "don't show your hand before you know the table." He paused. "I wasn't sure of the table until Agripath came from outside, until someone arrived who didn't owe Clifford Whitaker anything." Raymond looked at the land, his grandfather's land, his father's land, his land someday, and tried to hold the full measure of it. The $420 Clarence had saved, the April afternoon in 1959, the 6 decades of red soil and mesquite fence lines, and a rusted catavento that kept turning through everything. "You spent 30 years working land that was yours," he said. "I spent 30 years on my land," Walter said. "There's a difference." Raymond thought about that for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry I didn't stay." Walter looked at him, just looked at him. The way he looked at things he was measuring. "You're here now," he said. And that was all he said. But the way he said it, level, without reproach, with the same settled quality that Beverly had seen in the square that afternoon months earlier, meant something that Raymond would carry for the rest of his life. He reached out and took the last piece of pie. Walter let him have it. The following Tuesday, Beverly took the corner booth's small plaque out of her apron pocket and set it on the table, while Walter was in the restroom. It was a piece of polished pine, about 4 inches long, with the word "reserved" carved into it in letters that weren't quite even, because her nephew Tyler had never quite mastered the chisel, but had worked hard on it anyway. Walter came back, sat down, looked at the plaque, looked at Beverly. "Tyler made it," she said. "Don't say anything about the lettering." Walter looked at the plaque for another moment. He said, "It's good lettering." Beverly poured his coffee and went back to the counter. Neither of them mentioned it again, which was exactly the right amount of ceremony for both of them. As for Clifford Whitaker, he lost the land. He lost the sale. He lost the contract with AgriPath, which moved its distribution planning to a parcel north of the county that came with clear title and no complications. The Whitaker Holdings expansion that Clifford had spent 2 years negotiating collapsed entirely. He was not arrested. The crimes, the instruction to falsify county records, had been committed by his father in 1987, and the statute of limitations had long since passed. What Clifford carried was not a legal consequence, but a different kind. The knowledge of what had been built on, and the face of every person in Millhaven who now also knew. Beverly stopped serving him at the diner the week after the cooperative meeting. She didn't explain. She just said, when he came in and sat at the counter, "I don't have anything for you today, Clifford." And then she went to the back. He sat for a moment, and then he left. And he never came back. And Millhaven being what it was, the reason found its way to everyone who needed to know it without Beverly ever saying another word. The gray felt hat, for what it's worth, was found 2 days later, caught in a mesquite bush along the county road. Someone brought it to the diner. Beverly put it on the lost and found shelf by the register, where it sat for 3 weeks before she quietly put it in the bin. Some things, she figured, aren't worth retrieving. Walter Garrett is 68 years old now, by the time this story ends, in the way it properly ends. He sits on the porch most mornings before the heat comes in from the west. He has the same straight-back chair, no cushion, by preference, and the coffee that he's made himself now that the drive to Lanes has gotten longer in his knees, though he still goes twice a week. The catavento still turns in the morning wind, and he still hears it, the way you hear something you've listened to for 50 years. Not as a sound anymore, but as the texture of home. Raymond calls more often. Not dramatically more. Raymond is not a dramatic man, which is one of the things he got from his father, but more. He calls on Tuesday evenings, usually, and they talk about the land and the girls and the Dallas traffic and the small ordinary machinery of a life in motion. And sometimes they don't say anything much at all for a few minutes. And that is also fine. The metal biscuit tin is still in the cabinet above the stove. Inside it, the original deed in Clarence Garrett's name, signed and sealed in April 1959. The title correction certificate from the county recorder's office dated 93 days after the cooperative meeting. And a photograph that Raymond found in a box in the back bedroom. Clarence Garrett standing in front of the property with a fence post in one hand and a deed in the other. 1959. Squinting into the Texas sun, looking like a man who has just done something worth doing. Walter put the photograph in the tin himself. Some things you keep because they earned the keeping. Quiet men aren't weak men. Sometimes they're just waiting for the right room. The land remembers who worked it. So does God. And here is what Walter Garrett proved across 30 years of red earth and rusted metal and coffee drunk in the same corner booth. That patience, when it has truth underneath it, is not surrender. It is the longest form of certainty there is. He knew what he had. He waited until the world was ready to see it, and when it was, with a document folded in three, with edges barely golden from age, held in hands that had always looked like a map of honest work, he simply opened his palm. That was all it took. Now I want to ask you something before you go. If you had carried something true for 30 years, something that could change everything, but that you'd kept folded in your pocket, waiting for the right moment, would you have had the patience Walter had? Or would you have opened that door sooner? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I always want to know. If this story reached you, if it reminded you of someone who worked hard and waited long and was finally seen, share it with them. Some stories are meant to travel. This might be one of those. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Walter would appreciate it. I know I do.